Made to be. Bethany just loves little things like that, doesn't she? Made to be she. What was the other one? She works smart. Okay. Where's our video here? I had to scroll through it a little bit to get a screenshot for the thumbnail, which I'm gonna have to re-upload and everything because my stupid software.
What's up, y'all? It's Bethany and Kristen. I was actually
One sec, Bethany and Kristen, please. Thank you. Might add a link. I guess I can do that while it's playing though also. Just gonna. Okay. I'm gonna go ahead and start her here, and I'm just gonna add a link to my
listening
Tumblr
to
post real
a
quick.
sex therapist who is no longer with us. They have passed away, but they were sharing a statistic with me that was absolutely mind blowing. And I think you're going to be completely shocked by it as well. So it was talking about couples who are in an emotionally committed relationship. So whether they were married or not, they were in like a long term committed relationship. And this sex therapist basically traveled all over the world and spoke, has done. Written tons of books, has led like a leader in this movement, and they survey their audiences everywhere they go, and they ask their audiences, he asks them, raise your hand if you have sex with your eyes open. And so you're having sex and you're actually engaging and looking at your partner, your spouse. And he said, across the board, countries all over the world, only 20% of people in the audiences would raise their hand. So that means 80% of people are having sex
What?
with their eyes closed. And in most cases, that means they are trying to like remove their partner from their brain space, because the way that they are experiencing pleasure is basically like by themselves in a fantasy world. And so all over the world, this isn't just, even in countries that are like they have, you know, great sex education and sex is not a taboo topic, even in those countries only 20% of people have sex with their eyes open. And if you have little kids around, this is not a conversation for them to hear, because it's about to get a little bit more spicy. So then he takes the question a little bit further. And I just found this absolutely like revealing and so helpful to know, like, wow, this is where we are as a world. This is our understanding of sex. So he says, okay,
That is like, if that's a true statistic, that's a true statistic. That's like, I would not have predicted that. That are most people closing their eyes?
20% of people, only 20% of couples who are in emotionally committed relationships have sex with their eyes open.
Do you think they're exaggerating that? Or do you think the person that they got that from is maybe not as big of an expert as they're claiming them to be? Because that is, I don't know. That sounds crazy
And
to
then
me.
he says, of those people who have sex with their eyes open, and this is where it gets a little TMI, he says, how many of those couples, those 20%, can have an orgasm with their eyes open? And only half of that. So out of all the people in the world, on average, only 10% of people can
Mm,
engage with their partner while reaching a climax. And basically, what that shows us is that people literally
I mean, it feels kind of like just a automatic reaction to just, right? Okay, I won't get too TMI. I'll take Bethany's lead and not get too
90% of
TMI.
people who are in emotionally committed relationships have to remove their partner from their gaze. They have to remove that intimacy in order to experience some form of physical pleasure. They are not experiencing intimacy with
Is that a real dog? Oh my God,
one
Sophie.
another. They are experiencing a physical sensation, physical pleasure. And yes, they are together. They are bodies together, rubbing together, but heart to heart, mind to mind connection, that deep knowing that God intended us to have, we are literally removing it. And this is not intended to heap a bunch of like, oh, this is, you're doing this, like how terrible. This is actually a wake up call. This is a moment to say like, wow, not just Christians, but
Also, I was thinking about middle school plays earlier. I hope the middle school play was good. I was thinking about middle school plays I was in, and
people across the world.
a picture popped up in my memories today that was very, very
We have
embarrassing.
been missing it. God's incredible design for
Off
sex, God's
topic.
incredible design for intimacy, we are missing it. We are like, intimacy is being removed from the picture. And if you're feeling down or depressed right now, we actually, throughout this conversation, are going to share some incredible truths, some incredible wisdom. We're going to share personally, basically, how God's design for intimacy can be all that it was made to be. And instead of leaving here feeling like, okay, that's all, like, I
I haven't really watched a lot of girl defined content in general. Like I've watched a few things, especially when Bethany went through her whole deconstruction kind of thing. Um, but she talks like a pastor. Like she talks like a Baptist pastor. The way she like emphasizes it, like she's very
don't have
pastory.
that. Sex has been a really, like, it has been like not great in my marriage. I don't experience pleasure. You might be a woman where you're like, I like, it's a servicing for me. Like, I service my husband in this. It's not like, there isn't a sense of intimacy. I guarantee you by the end of this conversation, you're going to have direction. You're going to be like, wow, I know some steps I can take toward growing myself to have a better view of sex, and steps that I can take that actually will help me be able to experience more, to feel more, to have more intimacy, which is ultimately what God designed sex.
Oh, that's so great. I love seeing a middle school or high school theater kid that just kills it, and you're like, this is what they're meant to do.
To be.
Yes. And this is such a good conversation for women
Yeah.
because don't we feel like as women so often these
Sorry, again off topic. I noticed in other videos when I watch them back, I just like talk and I'm addressing chat messages. That's what I'm doing right now
conversations are like, oh, it's the
without the
man.
tags.
Like
Like,
sex is like somehow the man's thing, and then the woman is just like along for the ride, or I don't know how does she play a role in all of this? But it's God created the man
I think that's a you guys problem. I think that's a conservative Christian problem more than it is like a man and woman problem.
and the woman both equally sexual beings. And I think it's important to take a step back as we get into this conversation. It's a little
And I only say that because everything is just so patriarchal in that way that and even the way that they talk about it when you're like getting ready to get married or leading up to marriage, all the focus is placed on, well, your husband is going to want to do this, your husband is going to want, so you're going to have to do like that. They approach it in that way for women's entire life and then are surprised when it's something that they struggle with later on.
heavier, definitely a lot deeper as we talk about these topics. Like you said, probably not one that you want to
No.
have on playing on your speakers with all your little children around. Great when they're a little older, have some conversations about it, but one you might just want to pop in your earbuds or turn off till you can be by yourself. But just take a step back and just ask yourself, what has shaped my view of sex? What has been, if you had to write it down and you had to list in order, maybe the top 3 influences on how you think about sex and why you think the way you do, what would you write down? And that's very interesting because as I think about my own life and I think about what has shaped my view of sex the most, and in different seasons
For both of you, I could probably guess. I could probably guess what's shaped it, and it's your church and your religion,
it has
because that's how it was for me too.
been different things. And praise God, we grow and hopefully we learn and we mature and we reject lies and
I'm sorry to double pause. That's not to say that the culture at large doesn't have any influence, because obviously it does too. It's very male centric when it comes to sex and sexuality, with especially heterosexual couples. But um, yeah, if you grow up in a conservative Christian world, that is going to influence it more than anything.
believe truth. But I would say one of the biggest things that influenced my life, like as a whole life, would be and I don't know quite how to word this. I want to say purity culture,
Oh, yeah,
but
yeah,
what
yeah.
I want to
That's
say
good.
is like what the Bible says about sex, but presented in a way that's not accurately biblical. So it's like it's
A
coming. Okay, there we
religious
go.
view.
Which is what you guys did for a really long time, like over a decade. Like you pushed that narrative, but
Just
go
a
off.
religious
Yeah.
view of sex and intimacy. And one of the things that shaped my view the most was this idea that sex it is sacred. It is beautiful. It is God's design. The Bible teaches that it is made for the covenant of marriage. All of those things, yes, true, good, right, 100% there. But what happened in my own view of sex, which we talk about in our brand new book, Made to Be She,
Gotta get it. Go
Reclaiming
get it.
God's Plan for Fearless
There's made to
Femininity,
be
we
she.
wanted to write an entire section, multiple sections on not just sex, which we do have an entire chapter on God's radical design for sex, marriage, and intimacy, but we have another section where we talk about what I'm getting at right now, which is this purity culture era where
It reminds me of the
good
she, not the book itself, but just the name reminds me of the Shiwi or just those products like that where they
biblical things
heavily
like
marketed to
sex,
women.
God's design for that, were elevated to such a degree. Like, if you could save sex for marriage,
Ugh.
as much as you could possibly save in your mind, in your heart, and what you do, and who you look at, and you could save all of that for your wedding night, for your marriage, then you will have reached the ultimate satisfaction that God would ever have for a human being. Like, that is the ultimate way to enjoy it to the max. And yes, I believe in all of that, that you should, that it God designed it for marriage. It should be enjoyed within marriage. But the problem was that the emphasis was so much on saving it for marriage, and anything before is like bad. Don't think about it. Don't even try to like
Yeah,
understand and grow and learn about God's design for sex. Just save it all.
Yeah.
And then when you get married, somehow on your wedding night, you're just going to have this magical, explosive
yeah,
experience that's
exactly.
going to be so incredible that you're going to look back at your entire single years and all of the sacrifices and the waiting and the struggles and the praying, Lord, help me stay pure. You're going to look back and say, it was all worth it for this moment.
Listen, growth is great. I'm glad they've got grown beyond the brand of Girl Defined, like what they used to talk about. I am glad about that, but it is just really hard to hear this, like them saying this like it's brand new information when that's what people have been were telling them for like a decade. I don't know about decades, but like at least over a decade, they were like, your view of sex and sexuality is very limited. This is how it's harmful. This is how it can make you have like struggle with this in the future. And they were, they made fun of those people and they, like replied sarcastically or, they didn't agree. And then now they're like presenting this idea that people have been yelling at them for so long and they're like it's brand new information, like guess what guys, this is biblical femininity, the way we think of it isn't real. Like, yeah, no shit, that's what people have been telling you this
Moment,
whole time.
every single sacrifice. And that did not happen for so many people who grew up in the
Yeah.
purity culture. They got married and experienced
Yes, it's Kristen.
a lot of disillusionment, a lot of confusion. The sex on the first night was not this beautiful, explosive fireworks show.
Or
There
on
were
the
struggles,
second or the third or the
or the
fourth
second,
for
or
for
the
years.
entire honeymoon. And for me, I'll speak really personally. My first experience with sex on my honeymoon it wasn't terrible, but it wasn't all that it would be one day. It is so much better than it was in those early days. I did have a lot of
Hallelujah for that.
I did
Hallelujah.
have a lot of expectations, but I do look back on my first night and I have very fond memories. I honestly don't. I don't cry about it, think about it. Like, it
Yeah.
was beautiful for where
But some people do. Some people do. Some people look back on that first like year or even night or something and they have really bad like traumatic responses because they were just not prepared. So I'm glad that you don't. I'm glad that neither of these people do. But I I mean, even from people who are purportedly fundamentalists, they've told like kind of like quirky haha stories about how traumatic the first time having sex was because they had just no like roadmap for how to approach it, for what was going to happen, all the things that could go wrong or the things to expect. And that's the fundamental issue with the thing that Girl Defined sold for a really long time. That it doesn't prepare, not only doesn't prepare people, but it like sets them up for a really almost traumatic experience when they finally do have sex.
we were at the time, and I still cherish those memories, and so I'm thankful for that. My husband and I both came into it with more of a serving each other mindset. My husband's actually incredible in that way, and I'm so thankful, but there was still so much expectation that it is impossible for us to come from this perspective of this purity culture, save it all, and it's going to be the most incredible thing. What happens when it's not?
Mhm.
What happens
Again, like, yes, that's right. It's just so hard to hear it coming from these two when they sold this stuff that they're saying, like, what happens when this, like, what happens when it doesn't live up to your, like, you guys sold that ideal for so long that save yourself and everything until marriage and it'll be so amazing once you finally get to do it. Like, you contributed to that problem and people were telling you for a really long time, and I'm glad you moved past it, but
when it isn't everything
hard to
you were
take
told it
from
was going
them.
to be? Then where do you go from there? And I think so many people that we've talked to that have emailed us here at Girl Defined, women who are married, who've said, I've never told anyone this.
Yeah.
I do not enjoy sex within my marriage. I saved everything and it's not beautiful. It's not even fun. I don't
Yeah.
even want it. So what is going on?
Yeah.
And to hear that they were getting that kind of response from women who were followers of their page, like who actually like bought into their shit, and they still like towed that line of purity culture for so long, like, why did it take this long to have this light bulb moment? Maybe it was influenced by Dave and his little deconstruction kind of thing, but it just, again, I am glad they're moving past it, but it just, hearing all this stuff from them is just like rich. It's just very rich.
Is a
Yeah.
massive disconnect, which is why we unpack an entire chapter
Yeah.
on the ditch of religious womanhood, of how we take things that are good and biblical, but we twist them.
Idolize.
Yeah, and it's like, also, how do you address that? Like, when somebody's coming to you with a problem and they're like, the church says, how do you help them? Because what the church says is all of these things they're talking about that leads to this big expectation with no, knowledge or no plan for how to approach it. And so how do you like be like, well, maybe the church is wrong. And they would be like Bethany and Kristen for so long and be like, no, actually the church isn't wrong. Actually, this is the God's design for women. And it's like you can't penetrate that. You can't penetrate that idea until someone has a light bulb moment of their own. Like, actually, yeah, this doesn't work. This has created issues for me and I get it now. But that's what's so frustrating about deconstruction in general is that you can tell somebody all day, what's wrong, and it has to click for them eventually. And for everybody, that's different, and some people never get there.
As them and
We
yeah.
idolize them. We put them on a pillar in a way that God never intended for them to be, and we miss nuances of the bigger picture of what God is trying to even show us and teach us, and for us to experience through these acts. We
Yeah.
miss all of that, and it's just about this act of sex, and then it disappoints, and
Yeah.
then we become disillusioned. And for so many Christian women, they throw it all
Yeah.
out, and they're just done with the whole
Yeah.
thing. So it's so important that we're talking about this.
Because
I'm
they
going to say
haven't been
something
given
that
any tools
is
otherwise.
controversial, or it might sound very controversial when I say it, but
Let's
there
hear
is
it.
a phrase that really went around during the purity culture movement, and it's something that I'm sure both of us heard many times.
Purity culture movement is also rich coming from these guys. You guys like led the purity culture movement in like the 2010s. I need to get over that. Genuinely, I do. I need to get over it. They're in a different place now, but it I can't help but be pissed off because they pushed purity culture for so fucking long.
But it was this saying, save the beauty of sex for marriage. And it
Hmm.
was this whole idea that if you reserve this act for marriage, the act in itself is where the beauty, is where the meaning, is where the intimacy is found. So as long as you can get these two people that save sex for marriage when they bring their bodies together, if they can rub them the right way and pull out the right movements they read in those books, whoo, the stars are going to explode. And that's where the beauty is found, within the act itself. And here's what might come across as controversial. I don't think the beauty is in the sex. I think that is wrong messaging. And I think that's where many women, especially those who grew up in the purity culture movement, why they became so disillusioned with sex.
Yes, and it's also just like the putting sex on a pedestal of it all. Like when you tell girls and women to save everything, hand holding, kissing, whatever, until they're married. that puts sex on such a high pedestal that it's like the most sacred thing. And so it's like if once you get to it and you realize it can be messy, it can be painful, it can be awkward, like that has to really just pop that bubble so hard and fast and quick because nobody talks to anybody or any of girls or women about my experience, the mechanics of it all, like the things that can go wrong, the things to expect or whatever. So they just hold it on this pedestal, like this is going to be a romance movie or novel, like magical kind of thing. And especially for your first couple times, it's just not. It's awkward. It's kind of like I remember laughing through my first time, which was not in marriage, but because it's just kind of silly. You're like, oh, you're figuring it out. And so if you, yeah, holding it on that pedestal, it's just setting someone up for so much disappointment and failure. And it's just like, why is that not obvious? Why was that not obvious? Why is that not obvious to a lot of people, or including these guys for so long?
Sex within marriage because they saved it all. They went through the motions. They got things in the right places, They were
Mm.
like, we nailed it. We made it work. Our bodies are rubbing the right way. Maybe my husband is even very generous or I'm very generous to him sexually, but like where's the, like the sex doesn't feel beautiful, but we saved.
And sorry for another pause so quick after the other one, but it also just like the removal of like female sexuality from everything, like anything's even slight, like no sect of Christianity that's even sort of conservative or evangelical or anything puts any emphasis on female sexuality. It's all about, well, this is what your husband wants, and it's beautiful, and blah blah blah. But they never say like it's like men just get it easier with sex, like they just do, and women that well maybe it's not that as much as people are just not as knowledgeable in that department, but especially Christian women, and it's just like you don't even know how to approach it. It's just like I feel something here, but I don't know why I'm disappointed. I don't know how to get like, it's just a mess.
The
It's
beauty
a
of sex for
mess.
marriage. Why does this not feel beautiful? And here's what I want to say. I think the beauty of sex, the beauty is within the people. The beauty is within the creation, the one that God designed. It's the intimacy within, the open-heartedness, the honesty, the intimacy that the two people are creating. It's the meaning that they create with their bodies, what they're giving to each other, how they're loving each other. That's what creates mind-blowing, incredible, soul-satisfying sexual experiences, not just the act. You can take that same act and it can have a million different meanings. It can be the opposite of beautiful. It can be awkward. It can be embarrassing. It can be shameful. It can be destructive. It can be damaging. So the act itself isn't where the beauty is found. The beauty is found in the image bearers that God designed and those image bearers coming together. And just like that stat I quoted earlier, where 90% of couples are basically not able to reach climax with their eyes open, it shows you that we're relying on this act to try to satisfy us and to bring us this little bits of pleasure, but we're missing the person. We're missing the intimacy. We're missing the beauty within the people that God created. And so I think if we had changed the messaging within the purity culture movement and we had told young people and we had told couples that were getting married, the beauty is within you. It's what you bring to the marriage bed in that way that's going to make the sexual experience what it is. And I can tell you from personal experience that the more I
Okay, before we get into, I know Bethany is going to talk a lot about her own sex life, and quite frankly, I'm sad. I'm ready to hear about it. But um, the also just I think what would be really really helpful for especially a lot of Christian women is she said the term soul satisfying sex. And that's great. Yeah, some sex can be soul satisfying, but it also some of it isn't. And a lot of people, most people, like they need special. Like I'm trying to figure out a way to say this that is YouTube appropriate, that they're not gonna like strike me or something. Um, Thinking about how wonderful the person you're having sex with is, it doesn't get everybody off. Like it's just it's having an open dialogue and communicating with your partner about things that, work for you or don't, or work for them or don't. I think is the best way to actually get, super soul satisfying sex, but also just to not put it on this pedestal of it has to be a spiritual experience every time. If it is a spiritual experience for you at some point, that's so great and amazing, but it's not going to be that every time. Sometimes it's just going to be like, hey, do you want to have a quickie real quick? Like, like do something like before I go to work in the morning, and it's not going to be an eye-opening spiritual experience. It's just sex. It's not something crazy or it's like eating or drinking or it's just a normal human activity,
Individually have grown, the more my husband has grown, the more that we have developed like this place of radical honesty in our relationship. I mean,
which is
it's
great.
hard to be known. There are things we don't like
Mhm.
about ourselves. There's sin, there's ugliness, there's thoughts. Instead of pretending, having that radical honesty in your relationship, and then
Also, calling it radical honesty feels so griftery. Like I don't think she's trying to be griftery, but it just feels so like just communication. Radical honesty. You're communicating.
not servicing each other in an unhealthy like okay, I guess I'll just manage your sexuality,
Yeah.
coming together in a way where you are truly like open-hearted, loving, willing to be seen, willing to be known, willing to look into each other's eyes throughout the experience, willing to be like seen. That is terrifying. In some ways it's terrifying to be truly known. When we can do that, when we
Sure.
can get past that fear of really being known, and we can bring our whole selves to the relationship, that's where the beauty can be found. The beauty can be found in that way. If you think about our relationship with Christ, and you think
Hmm.
about how marriage is a reflection of the gospel, and you think about how
Oh,
sex
here
truly
we go.
also is a reflection of the gospel, and that always freaks people out because it's a deep knowing. Yada is the word that we see in scripture. Yada, a deep knowing.
I've never ever understood, even when I was like would have identified as Christian, I would never understood this analogy she's making, which is that sex is a reflection of like your relationship with Jesus or the gospel. I'll just be clear. And maybe that's just because I couldn't understand it, but I still don't. If anybody wants to clarify that for me, I would be happy.
We were designed to have a deeply intimate
Mhm.
relationship with Christ, not sexual, a deep, all knowing. I know you, Lord, and you
Yeah.
I knew a lot of girls in youth group who would have banged the ripped Jesus that was in
know
the
me, and
auditorium,
you have revealed yourself to me, and I'm
not the
revealing myself to you.
not the statue, but him as a
That is
person.
where ultimate satisfaction is found. And
Mhm.
in marriage, and then in sex, it is the place where that deep intimacy can be found. But
Also, I'm so sorry, but there is like another separate conversation that needs to be had about getting a crush on Jesus because you're told your whole like horniest time in your life, like when you're a preteen or a teenager or a young adult, that you're like a bride of Christ so much, and you're like, and then there's all these hot Jesuses with six packs hanging all around the sanctuary and stuff, and it's just like, am I supposed to be horny for Jesus?
many of us never experience that because
And
we
I was,
actually don't want
and
to
I
be
was.
known, and we don't truly want to know our spouse. We're like, actually, I'd rather not know certain things about you, and I'd rather not have certain conversations, and I'd rather just shove things under the rug, and I'd rather
Mhm.
not tell you that thing that I did or this thought I have when we're actually having sex because that would just blow everything up. I'd rather stick with this super mediocre sex than really have radical honesty, than really deeply know each other. Can you imagine if we had that relationship with Christ, which many of us try to have? We try to hide from him, but he knows us anyway. But that's where the beauty in our relationship with Christ is, in
Yeah.
that yada, that deep knowing. And that's what we need to take into marriage. And it's terrifying and it's scary. And you're like, that's why, I mean, again, to be so blunt, that's why so many people find masturbating a lot easier. You don't have to be open. You don't have to be
Yep.
intimate. And what's crazy is that you go and you have sex with your spouse, but you're
I'm reading the chat, by the way, for people watching the replay. No to, not even to marital, told my client no to touching oneself ever, not even in the marital bed. I never cursed with this person because I know it makes her uncomfortable, but I said, I respect your faith. Which I never thought that way, though. Or I never thought of it that way. Well, that's good that, I mean, that they're open at least to, being like, oh, I never thought about it that way. The anti-masturbation of it all, though, is another whole topic I could rant about for so long. It's especially for women. I can't tell you. I actually I remember as a teenager, and this is in Bethany's words, completely TMI. As a teenager, I would apologize to God like after I masturbated because I felt so guilty and it was just so hammered into me that that was so wrong for women to do, that it was like it just was bad. Like God was watching you the whole time and he was judging you, and that kind of stuff really messes with your brain and it has lasting effects. And I know I have struggled with lasting effects from that in the sexuality department. I I have struggled to be honest about my sexuality. I know these guys like these. I think the reason they're talking so emphatically, like and excitedly, like this is brand new information, is because they relate to it so much. They're like, oh yeah, I can't wait to communicate this because I relate to this so much, and maybe purity culture actually sucked, and it did, and it fucked up a lot of women, myself included, and I'm sure these guys. I don't know. I don't know where I was going with that, but
You're kind
that's
of
where
just using them to masturbate. Honestly, it's a really crude way to say it, but you're closing your eyes. You're like, okay, if I can just get rid of you, then I can experience pleasure. I mean, how sad is that? That's the state that we're in. And I truly think that purity culture can.
okay, Bethany. So, what my question for you there is, what do you recommend for women who, in like your kind, like your sect of Christianity, your like flavor of Christianity? What do you recommend if that's what they need to do to get through it? If their husband is not open to anything that will make them be able to climax without doing that, or oh God, I had a third point. I think I just forgot it. Or if their religion is opposed to anything like toys or something that could help in that department. And I hope you address that.
Contributed to that for a lot of us, and that's why we're left so disillusioned, wondering
Yeah.
like, why isn't sex all that amazing? And I'm telling you though, just from a positive standpoint, that it can be the most beautiful, the most mind-blowing, the most physically amazing, stars exploding experience, but it comes with that growth and with
Yes.
that development of willing to be intimate, of willing to have those eyes open. And that's why I'm so passionate about Made to Be She, and specifically in chapter
Made to
7,
be she.
we decided to include an entire
Mm-hmm.
chapter on this because not only of the impact of the religious womanhood movement, which we talked about in Made to Be She, we talk about how this religious movement impacts us. And if you don't
Oh, I'm gonna need them to say at like least at one point that they contributed to that movement
think
very
that
heavily.
impacts your sexual experience, it does. That's why taking
100%.
steps to grow
Yeah.
personally is the best thing you can do. Instead of thinking right now, well, my husband, no. Start with yourself. If you want to change your marriage and if you want to change like the kind of sex that you're having, and if you're like, I want to create better meaning, I want to create true intimacy, don't worry about your husband right now. Start with yourself. And I guarantee you that Made to Be She is an incredible place to start.
Here comes the grifting.
It's not a book about sex, the whole
Right.
book, but it changes your
Yeah.
ability to be honest. It changes your view of what God really says, and it changes your view of what you're able to bring to the relationship. And in chapter 7, God's radical design for marriage and sex, we actually unpack God's entire perspective of why he created intimacy. We unpack why God created sex in the first place. We unpack why it's between a man and a woman and what all that represents. We unpack what marriage is truly supposed to be. We even unpack things like submission, which is woo,
The
we
S
have
word.
we have a section
I think if I were a progressive Christian who had come from the background I came from, and I was listening to Bethany say this right now, I would wonder what authority does she have to decide what God planned for anything? Like there's so many different interpretations of everything from the Bible and everything that Christianity holds as tenets, like every sect of Christianity holds a different opinion. And that would be my a red flag kind of goes up or what God meant because that's exactly what she said with Girl Defined. Like when they were participating in purity culture and doing the purity culture thing with Girl Defined, they said the exact same thing. Like God honoring ways to, or what God wants. Like what gives you personally the right to define that? What gives you the right to or the knowledge, what expertise do these two women have to say what God honoring sexuality is? Like essentially that's what they're doing here. Like What a way to have God honoring sex and be super Christian, you know? It's I don't know. But Bethany says it because it sells courses and books and, everything else she's talking, whatever thing she's talking at the
Called
time.
Sex is a Celebration, and we go into
Yeah.
all of why it's actually a celebration. If you're like, sex has never felt like a celebration, we
Mm-mm.
unpack that.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I was like, I was done. That's all.
We unpack
We unpack that.
Yes, because it is so much more tying in. I think a lot of times as Christians, even in purity culture movement, we separate sex from spirituality. Like,
For sure.
that sex is
That is not true. That is not true. You tie it in purity culture. Sex is so tied to spirituality. You can't, it's like the ultimate thing on the pedestal that you can't do until you're married, and being married is a spiritual contract in blah 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 blah, et cetera, et cetera. That is false. In my opinion, patently false.
almost this thing that Hollywood came up with.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah,
we
yeah,
don't say
exactly.
this and
Yeah.
we don't actually believe this, but we
Yeah.
operate like this
Yeah.
is reality.
Mm-hmm.
That sex is something that Hollywood created, that Cosmo magazine promotes, which we have a lot to say about Cosmo magazine and all their lies, by the way, in this book. But
Yeah.
it's something that
Leave Cosmo alone.
we think came from the world, and that it's almost worldly, when in fact sex, we know this as Christians because we see it in Genesis 1 and 2, that God created the male and the female, and then created marriage, and then placed them in it and said, be fruitful and multiply, by having sex, by having intimacy. In fact, you mentioned the word yada, and actually one of the first
We
places that
didn't
the
say
word
sex.
yada is used is in the Old Testament, where God is talking about a couple having sex, physical intimacy, and saying that he knew his wife. And then we see it again in the spiritual sense when King David is writing Psalms and talking about God, and he's talking about how God knew him, not sexually, but knew him intimately
Yes.
as a person, knew his heart, loved.
Wait, what? What was that? What does David have to do? What? Maybe I was like, my husband came in the room, so I was wait. Maybe I missed something, but like,
him,
Yeah.
cared for him. The same word knew that's used over here for sex is the same word the Bible uses for how God
hello.
intimately and deeply
Yeah.
knows his children. Yada, yada. I mean, that is mind blowing.
Yeah.
So, sex is spiritual. It's a
What translation of the Bible is yada in? Because that was not the in my memory, not in the New International Version.
spiritual
Yeah.
reality, and it points to something so much greater than just the physical act of bodies coming together. There is something spiritual that God is trying to convey, that he's trying to show us, and it's the fact that the same way that God knows us, the way he yadas us and loves us so intimately, that is to be that same
This is just extrapolating on the weird, like the getting a crush on Jesus kind of thing. Like it's there is like I'm I very very much remember people talking to me in a way as a young teenager, young adult, whatever, that Jesus is your fucking husband. And it's I think it's almost like an attack, like a technique to make you attached to your church or religion or whatever they're trying, like in a way, because who are you more attached to than somebody you're in like a romantic relationship with, or sexually, somebody you're sexually attracted to? Because I remember thinking it was weird, but it worked on me. I remember being like, oh, okay, there's all these hot Jesuses around, and they're like, he's you should think of him as your husband, and the church is his wife, and you need to act in a way, in that kind of way. And it's so weirdly sexualized. And I know these guys have heard and experienced the same thing because they grew up more conservative than me. And I think that like probably really skews their perception on healthy sexuality and what is normal and what sex should and can be. Like, yeah, sometimes it can be amazing, and a spiritual experience is something that you're like, this is something only I can only have this here, like a kind of experience. But sometimes it's not always that. It's not, it's not fasting. It's not. It's just it's sex. It's not. It's not a religious uh ritual. It's not something you need to do for God, I guess is my point.
Same knowing is what God wants in marriages between a
Mhm.
husband and a wife. That same deep knowing, that same yada, that is a beautiful celebration because we're ultimately, sex is reminding
Yada
us.
is a
You
new
see,
one to
God
me.
saying, you see how deeply intimate this act is and how deep you should know each other within marriage, the way that you're talking about that deep knowing. That is how much
Oh yeah, a nun. Yeah, that's another really, really good point, especially for Catholics. Like the nuns are technically the wives of Jesus, like or brides of Jesus. Like, well, that's the way that my Catholic family and their churches have always viewed it. So that is another, I think they just kind of wedge that in. So because who do you have the deepest mental ties to? People who you view as your life partner or your husband or your boyfriend or your girlfriend or anybody like that.
I love you and even more.
Yeah.
I know you and I love you so fully, more than you could ever even know or love your spouse. That's the type of gospel love that I have for you, my children. And it's
Mhm.
a mind blowing
See,
and it
again,
is a celebration of not just physical sex,
that's again, it's like you have a deeper connection to Jesus in this way than you do even your spouse.
but also God's incredible,
Yeah.
yada, knowing love for us. And one of our favorite people, Dr. Julie Slattery, who has a lot of
Yeah.
incredible biblical teaching on sex,
Julie.
specifically for women. We actually quoted her here
Not
in this chapter
Julie.
that
Oh,
you wrote
Jesus.
in our book. She says God created sex for a lot of reasons, for procreation,
I just did that all just to say, not Julie.
for pleasure, for intimate knowing between a husband and wife. However, one of the most
Mm.
important reasons he created sex is to communicate about himself. God created sex and the covenant of marriage to be
What? Oh,
a
no.
brilliant metaphor of how deeply he knows us and longs for us to know him. Sexual intimacy is a powerful picture of the gospel, of the degree of intimacy and ecstasy we are capable of having with God in a non sexual way.
Oh,
The Christian
no.
marriage is designed to be a showcase of this masterpiece. The romantic longings of a single woman mirror the longings of a bride who was waiting for the ultimate
Yes, focus on the family, my op, as the kids say.
salvation, the coming of Christ. To the extent that our understanding and experience of sex is damaged and twisted, our view of God is compromised. Here's the takeaway: what you think about sex really matters. Having God's perspective on the topic, whether you are single or married, is a vital piece of your growth as a daughter of God. And this is why we're so
Yeah.
passionate about this, because it is true.
I think that's a really good point. Ooh, 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 sorry. Okay, I just ripped a charger out of the wall. Everybody ignore that. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. It's the equivalent of sarcastically rolling your eyes, and however the Bible intended, yeah, something different from a Hebrew word yada. And when I hear people like this invoke Hebrew words a la what's her ass, Carissa Collins, and it's like people who are really deeply, deeply either evangelical or Baptist, or it just makes me roll my eyes because they don't have any other they uh they grab these Hebrew words and they appropriate them and they have nothing, no other like fingers in Jewish culture or Hebrew or like they just grab these words out of the air and are like, oh, that makes me feel more connected to Christianity because it did start as Judaism. And so there's a lot of Jewish words and practices that got transferred over, but yeah, are distinguishably different. Judaism is distinguishably different, but yeah, it's so annoying in my opinion. I don't even know if the Bible, I've read the King James and I have a bad memory of I've only like gone through it once and to be honest it sucks and it's a bad translation in my humble opinion. Well, not in my humble opinion and every Bible scholar's opinion it's a bad translation, but it's not a great read in my opinion. But I don't remember the word yada. I think that that's something they're just kind of grasping in their weird evangelical appropriation like they do with so many things and they're probably just completely miss like placing it on sexuality is a lot. It's a lot. It's a lot to try to be like your sexual connection with your husband should be like your connection with God, and that's right back into being like the bride of Jesus
This is
kind
a
of thing.
vital piece of your growth as a daughter of God. Understanding marriage and sex within the context of the gospel changes everything.
Yeah. And I love that you're bringing up the spiritual aspect of it because many of us, it's like we
Using the
we
I
we are
keep looking at the chat on my phone, but I'm using the iPad now. In scripture, Shada means to know, which can refer to sexual intercourse. Okay, but yeah, if that, I'm sure they have like some idea of what it means. I just were like, maybe they're correct. They could totally be correct in their interpretation. Like I said, I don't know I've never encountered Yada in any scripture or anything I've read, but I have read the KGB and I forgot like 90% of it. So could be in there. But yeah, I just worry that they misinterpret Hebrew words because so many people of this flavor of Christianity do that. They grab a Hebrew word and they think it makes them like feel more authentic, and they apply it to something that either has no bearings on what they actually believe, or they just, like Carissa Collins, like I mentioned, straight up steal a Jewish tradition, the Hebrew words associated with it, and have no acknowledgement for why that's weird or wrong, or it just I my my thing I think with all of this is that my underlining point is I don't think we need to tie sex to spirituality so much. I think you can absolutely have a great and wonderful spiritual experience during sex sometimes. I think you can have, like something that makes you feel like, oh, this is part of something more than myself. And this is great and wonderful and something else is going on here just besides physicality. But the way they're doing it and being like, it actually can be great. Like, it actually should be attached to God all the time, and you need to be doing it a certain way to do that. And if you don't feel a connection with God while you're doing it, maybe you're doing like maybe that's not what they mean, but that's what their insinuation feels like to me, is that you actually can be having sex for God and having a what did they say, like fireworks every single time or something. And this is how you do it. And buy Bethany's book, He Be She, or whatever the fuck it's called.
confused about that. We're like at the celebration, a deeply knowing God.
But I agree. I deeply agree with everything you say. I'm gonna say Drac it because I don't think that's right though. Drake it, Drac it, Drake it, Drake it, girl. I deeply agree with everything you say. And, and yeah, it's focus on the family. God, focus on the family could be a whole video on its own. I'll probably need to address them at some point because I cannot even express how much my mother was influenced by Focus on the Family. Good grief.
I don't, like I'm blocking my spouse out when we're having sex. Like
Right.
that's the only way I can actually enjoy it. We're so like
And I need the citations for where they get this thing that they keep quoting, that 90% or 80% or whatever they said of people are closing their eyes and blocking their spouse out during sex.
it
I
breaks my
need
heart
the
because I'm like,
receipt.
as Christians, I think that Christians should be having the most deeply intimate sex of everyone in the
Mhm.
world because we
Oh, sorry to pause again. I wonder if it's from a Christian poll.
actually know like what the greater picture is. We know that it's about intimacy, not just rubbing bodies together, but we know that to be deeply known by someone, to be deeply loved, and then to have that physical pleasure.
That's right, you told me. You told me Drake it before, but in my head, because I've seen your URL on Tumblr, I always say Drac it. Like every from the first time I've ever seen your URL, I'm like Drac it. and it gets stuck in my
Measurable
head.
component that God gave us to go along with it. It's like that's what makes it out of this world amazing. And you'll hear from like when people are honest and when certain like this sex therapist that I was talking about, when he's talked to crowds and talked to people, you'll hear that like sex is people who aren't even like that spiritual in a sense will be like, wow, I like it feels spiritual to them, even though they're not that spiritual because it is. It's one of the most spiritual things that you can do because it's a direct reflection of the gospel, whether you realize it or not. And so that's why it's so important to not only like have a truly honest, authentic, deeply all-knowing relationship with God that will help you to be able to take that authenticity, that honesty, that genuineness into your relationship with your spouse. And
I will say I disagree. I disagree with that. I it would take too much time to explain why I disagree, but I disagree with the fact that sex is an inherently spiritual experience.
now you can just sit here and say, okay, that's too scary. That's too hard. I don't want to be honest. I don't want to know him. I don't want him to know me. We can just keep our eyes closed and pretend that everything's okay. You can continue on with your life in that way, but it's not going to change. Your marriage isn't going to change. Your sex isn't going to change. All that deep, intimate knowing that God created for you and your spouse to have, it's not going to change. And if you're single and you're thinking like, oh, but I don't even have my person, starting with Made to Be She is going to be a massive springboard forward because the depth of maturity and the depth of like honesty that you have, your relationship with Christ, you can invest in that now. And if God does have marriage for you, you get to bring that in. It's not a waste. Imagine getting to start your marriage at a much more mature place, like with this information, rather than like, oh, I just kind of like, like, okay, save the beauty of sex for marriage, purity culture. Like, no, like you can actually get equipped and grow and bring that so you're capable of that deeply intimate, mature.
The way she's talking about this is so triggering because that is how everybody talks to you as if you're, between the ages of 13 and like 25 in a Christian community. It's like make sure your relationship with Christ has a good foundation. And I remember being 100% a believer, 100% like in it and thinking, I don't know what my relationship with Christ is like. He does never talks back to me. It's only me. How do I make it better if I don't know what he's saying? And other people, that's a whole thing too. Other people will be like, "Oh, you can hear what he says, or you'll feel what he says," and it's just a ugh, PTSD, Bethany.
Relationship. It takes maturity. It takes humility to be known that deeply. And now I
That's
actually
true.
in Made to Be She, we give a flyover of the picture of the love story that marriage represents because we've talked quite a bit about how
Oh God, if it's between a person and the church, I'm gonna lose it.
sex is a picture of the gospel, marriage is a picture of the gospel. And I know some of you are like, what the heck are you talking about? Like, I don't get it. And so we actually wrote in depth, like very in depth, all about that in Made to Be She. But I'm going to give you the highlights because I don't want to read the whole chapter to you right now on the podcast. So here's kind of like a snapshot of that. So God creates a man and a woman and unites them in covenant marriage. We're going back to the garden.
Yep.
Adam and Eve starting in the beginning.
Genesis 1.
Genesis 1. The couple lives in perfect harmony with one another and with God. They experience deep, all-satisfying intimacy in every way possible. This is when everything was perfect. Everything is perfect. The couple rebels against God and intimacy is broken. That's when that first like intimacy,
Wait,
sin, shame,
hold.
and guilt.
What the hell is she reading from? Did I miss it? What is she reading from?
Are you talking about? Like, I don't get it. And so we actually wrote in depth, like very in depth, all about that. And
Is it from her own book?
Made to Be She, but I'm going to give you the highlights because I don't want to read the whole chapter to you right now on the podcast.
From her own book, how sex should be like between you and the church. Got it.
So here's kind of like a snapshot of that. So God creates a man and a woman and unites them in covenant marriage. We're going back to the garden.
Yep.
Adam and Eve starting in the beginning.
Genesis 1.
Genesis 1. The couple lives in perfect harmony with one another and with God. They experience deep, all-satisfying intimacy in every way possible. This is when everything was perfect.
Hearsay. We have no first-hand accounts.
Everything is perfect. The couple rebels against God and intimacy is broken. That's when that first like intimacy, sin, shame, and guilt now plague the couple and they no longer walk in the garden with God. This impacted their relationship with God and their relationship with others. We already see the hiding, the shame that came into place. After years of sin and broken relationship with God, the groom Jesus is prophesied to come and save his people. This brings home that perfect intimacy
Prophesy.
can one day be restored. Jesus, who is the groom, that's the picture of the groom,
Yes, the church congregation is technically Jesus's bride, man or woman. It makes a very confusing experience when you are in your very hormonal
gives his life on the
development
cross in
as a
pursuit of
child.
his people. Those who receive his invitation of new life in him become his bride, the church. So we have Christ as the groom and the church as his bride. Christ is in heaven preparing a beautiful wedding
Hmm.
That's why so many girls get crushes on him.
feast for his bride, the church. So Christ
And
is in
boys.
heaven, he's
And boys to be equal.
preparing a wedding feast. One day, I can't read for some reason right now. One day, all will be made perfect in this relationship when true intimacy is found in heaven at this wedding celebration.
Hmm.
The bride, his church, so that's all of us who have trusted in him for salvation, we receive Jesus' sacrificial love and
Which, can I just say, without like ranting too long, is such a confusing metaphor. It's so confusing to be like, the church is Jesus's bride and he's the groom. That is so confusing, especially when you're like first initially working through your hormones and like feelings and all of those things. Like that is so confusing. I think that that is like purposeful messaging at the heart of it on purpose because it's meant to make you feel connected to your religion or church or whatever in a way that is stronger than just saying, "Oh, he does nice things for you. Jesus did this for you and it's a nice thing." Well, actually, he's your husband. He's your spiritual husband and you got to act like his spiritual wife.
he begins preparing for the day. We begin preparing for the day when she will be with her groom Jesus
Hmm.
again. So we
Yes.
are
My
preparing
groom
to see our groom
Jesus.
one day while we're on this earth. Jesus is in heaven, and this is the gospel love story.
The other thing that confused me growing up was, okay, so if I'm supposed to marry like a Christian guy who continues this all, who is the actual groom there? Like, is Jesus the ultimate groom? Like, he's who I'm going to later, and I'm not gonna, whatever husband from church I pick is not gonna be relevant, or does he factor in eventually?
That marriage reflects. It's romantic and it's breathtaking because Christ pursued each one of us while we were still sinners. He loved us, He came after our hearts, He died for us, and He is preparing the ultimate wedding feast so that one day we can be united in perfect.
You just see how weird this language is, especially to tell children. Like this was told to me as a child. Like Christ is preparing, like the blah blah blah, and it's like, okay, I'm 6. That sounds great. This is so weird, actually. I haven't like heard somebody talk about Jesus in this way for a really, really long time, like to my face. So this is
Intimacy
so
again. One day,
uncomfortable.
all of the longings of our heart, everything about us that we so long to be deeply satisfied, to be
Yeah.
deeply known, we can experience a bit of that in our relationship with Christ. We can trust in him for our salvation. We can know that one day we will be together with our groom one day, and we can look forward to that, just like a bride anticipates her wedding. And we see that in the Old Testament, the
Mm-hmm.
preparations. He's preparing a place for her. He would often go off and prepare, and then they have this wedding feast, and then the consummation of the relationship. And so if you go from Genesis all the way and we unpack that in depth, that was like the ultimate
Yes.
flyover. We unpack that in depth inside Made to Be She in chapter 7. But we see
By Made to Be She on 27.99 on Amazon, guys.
literally from Genesis 1 through the very end of Revelation that there is this love
That's a joke. Don't do that.
story. There is this like picture of marriage that is Christ and the church, and we see that throughout all of Scripture. And I'm like, so of course, marriage
Yeah.
and intimacy would be one of the most spiritual things on earth. And I encourage you to gain a more spiritual
Right.
perspective of that, to be able to understand what you are doing as a married woman, just being in a marriage and that covenant and what it represents, why God's design for the man and the woman, why sex matters, why just bodies rubbing together doesn't create intimacy, but how to actually have true intimacy and why that all matters. And in Made to Be She, we're going to
Mm-hmm.
really help walk you through
Mm-hmm.
that.
I
Made
love
to
that you
Be
brought up that
She.
Genesis to Revelation because as Christians, we
I just think all of this, it sounds exactly like it did to me when I was 13, 14, 15, 19, 20. Like it makes sense hearing her say that, like it sounds like she's making sense, like sensical connections, but when you actually try to apply it to your life, it doesn't make any goddamn sense.
should be the most informed on the
Yes.
fact that the entire Bible is this incredible, beautiful love story of Christ dying, sacrificing for his bride, the bride responding
Again, love
to the
story.
groom, the wedding feast and
Yeah.
revelation that Christ is preparing this place for his bride, the church, to
That's
one day
good question. Again, why are we sexualizing
they
Jesus so
go to.
much?
It is so romantic
Yeah.
and so beautiful, shows the
And
incredible, intimate love that God has
romantic.
for us. And yet, so often as Christians, we miss all of that.
Yeah.
And we
All
just
of it.
think of sex as like, okay, safe sex for marriage. That's the big goal for Christians. We teach our children safe sex for marriage. Yes, that is part of it. We're not saying don't teach that, throw that
I gotta be right back. I gotta pee.
out. We're
Yeah.
not saying that at all. We're saying that is just a tiny
Yes.
piece. That's like a little to-do box, like a little checklist that we've made it when it's really so much
So much
more than
bigger.
that and so much bigger. And there's a ginormous, beautiful message that God is trying to
Yeah.
show us through the act of marriage and through the act of intimacy within marriage through sex. There is so much there that we are
Yeah.
completely missing. And so we're missing it in the way we function in our marriages and our
Yes.
relationships as single people, the way that we even think about sex. We're missing it in and why we, like, let's say, battling sexual sin, we're even missing those
Yeah.
components and how we think
Absolutely.
about battling sexual sin. So we think, well, I mean, just pornography here and there, it's not a big deal. Or, masturbating on my own, what's the big deal there? We're missing it because we're thinking, okay, these things, sure, okay, maybe they're sin, God, please forgive me. We're missing the bigger picture of what all of this is for, of what the sexual design is for. And so when we start to understand more of this gospel-centered picture, then we can clearly see why pornography is so damaging, why it's missing everything that God created sex to be, why we can see masturbation. I mean, that's getting off on a whole nother
Yeah.
topic. We've talked about this in other podcasts, other books. We've got Sex, Purity, and the Longings of a Girl's Heart, another book we wrote if you're like, I want to deep
Yeah.
dive on just that topic. But there's so much that God wants us as
Mm-hmm.
Christians to understand. And so we're not just saying grab a copy of Made to Be She because we want you to buy our book. We wrote this book
Yeah.
for this time when
It's
we
true.
as women, I feel like, are more confused than ever from purity culture, the feminist movement, lies on both sides. We want to help women get back to what gospel redeemed
Mm-hmm.
womanhood looks like. So we
Oh,
hope you'll grab a
oh,
copy
oh.
for that reason, to find freedom and fullness in Christ, in what the sexual
People rewatching this are probably like, thank God she left so I could get like about 2 minutes. I did hear the feminist movement. I need to hear what they say
in our
about that.
marriages and our
Yes.
relationships as single people, the way that we even think about sex. We're missing it in and why we, like, let's say, battling sexual sin, we're even missing those
Yeah.
components and how we think
Absolutely.
about battling sexual sin. So
Interesting how you didn't address sexual sin and how it's directly correlated to the way the church talks about sex and sexuality as a
we think,
whole.
well, I mean, just pornography here and there, it's not a big deal. Or, masturbating on my own, what's the big deal there? We're missing it because we're thinking, okay, these things, sure, okay, maybe they're sin, God, please forgive me. We're missing the bigger picture of what all of this is for, of what the sexual design is for. And so when we start to understand more of this gospel-centered picture, then we can clearly see why pornography is so damaging, why it's missing everything that God created sex to be, why we can see masturbation. I mean, that's getting off on a whole nother
Yeah.
topic. We've talked about this in other podcasts, other
Interesting. Yeah, getting off on a whole nother topic. It seems like that's actually on topic. That's like very on topic. Interesting how you
books.
guys get into that.
We've got Sex, Purity, and the
Feels like this was a long ad for Bethany's Made to Be She.
Longings of a Girl's Heart, another book we wrote if you're like, I want to deep
Yeah.
dive on just that topic. But there's so much that God wants us as
Mm-hmm.
Christians to understand. And so we're not just saying grab a copy of Made to Be She because we want you to buy our book. We wrote
That's
this
what
book
shirts
for
say.
this time when
It's
we
true.
as women, I feel like, are more confused than ever from purity culture, the feminist movement, lies on both sides. We want to help women get back to
The, not to say that the feminist movement is perfect, it's not, but the big majority of struggle American women have had, I think, by and large, is because of the puritanical nature of our culture and Christianity, especially conservative Christianity, which shames them for being sexual, which shames any kind of sex that these guys have also claimed, like, sex needs to be a spiritual experience, or, maybe you're doing it wrong. Like, it's just, it's, got a lot of issues with that.
what gospel redeemed womanhood
Just that.
looks like. So we hope you'll grab a copy for that reason, to find freedom and fullness in Christ, in his design for you. Grab a copy, girldefined.com/she. Come back and join us for another episode of the Girl Defined Show.
Oh, I don't know if I will. I don't know if I will, girls. Okay. Well, like everything with those guys, it's just, again, kind of information that sounds like they presented as brand new information when it's what everybody has been yelling at them for a decade. And I just really have a problem with making sex, like connecting sex to spirituality in the way that it makes it like if you're not having a spiritual experience every single time you have sex, then something is wrong, which is almost like an overcorrection from how the purity culture movement addressed it and how Christianity has addressed sex before that, because before that, it's all just, your husband wants to have sex and you need to do that because that's what you're designed to do as a woman. And purity culture is all like, kind of emphasizing that, like, you'll have sex with your husband and it will be great. And just wait till, sorry, Bert, just wait till you get married and everything will be awesome and great and you'll just know how to do it. Everybody will just know because it's your natural role. You're naturally the submissive one, your husband's naturally the dominant, and you'll just figure it out. And of course, that never works. It never works, and it creates like high expectations that people almost never can live up to. And there's no open channel for communicating about what works and what doesn't for people sexually, and it's different for every person. So there's no like roadmap you can just make like for well, I mean, like for especially in Christianity, you can't just say like do this and this and this and everything will be okay because it won't be okay. It's different for every person. So that's just Girl Defined continues to be extremely frustrating to me. And I am very interested. If I'm interested in anything with Girl Defined, I want to know how Dave is doing. I want to know because if you don't know, Dave is Bethany, the taller one's husband. He did last year a complete maybe even like late 2023. I can't remember exactly. Um, a deconstruction from their very conservative brand of Christianity, and he to the point where he said that he doesn't even know if he considers himself Christian at all. And I wonder how much his deconstruction is influencing this kind of content. It's interesting to me that Kristen is participating in this kind of content with Bethany. Although there's not like any crazy progressive revelations in that video for me. It just kind of all like it seems like they're trying to say the right things, but then like connect it back to the points that they've made in Girl Defined for so long that, sex is spiritual, sex is between a man and a woman only, or a married man and a woman only. Uh, if you do it right, you're gonna feel like you're connected to God. And I don't know. I have rants I could do about all of those points, but I'll go ahead. Oh, excuse me. I'll go ahead and I'll end it there because I know I just paused and talked a lot during that one. Uh, I didn't hope for much, but with Dave's deconstruction, I did hope for a little bit better, a little bit more like something, but I didn't get it, and that's okay. Maybe we'll check in with them later, but if you're here still watching, thank you for watching. I know I'm sorry for being late. I had uh, technical issues and I grabbed, I'm sorry, I had a sneeze coming while I said that. Technical issues, and I grabbed something hot while I was cooking and burned myself. So that is probably, like my husband said in his Tumblr post, not the last time something like that's going to happen because I'm very clumsy and have ADHD. So, alrighty. Thank you if you're still watching. I will be back next Saturday. Please let me know if you have any ideas on what to watch. I don't know what to watch. So much funny stuff is centered around children, It's very hard to get that, like, you sieve or filter. Oh, I said sieve, and that's not the right word. Filter that stuff out of the rest of the stuff. Okay, my brain's not working, so we'll go ahead and end it. Thank you for being here. Bye, guys. I will see you later. Thank you.